Out of all the presidents in the history of the U.S., which one would you want to meet the most? There's a lot of good choices to choose from. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, or Franklin Roosevelt. For me, it would be President John F. Kennedy. After studying many presidents for previous assignments in my classes, I determined that Kennedy is by far my favorite president because of his leadership during an extremely tense period within the U.S. Today I want to talk to you a little about his leadership during the Cold War era, his development of the civil rights movement and the space race, as well as some of the controversies surrounding his presidency. To start things off, Kennedy was put into office in 1961 at a time when tension between the Soviet Union and the United States was at an all-time high, and he was faced with an immediate problem, which was the Bay of Pigs invasion. This invasion was designed to overthrow the government put in place by Fidel Castro within Cuba. But in an article written by Christopher Klein on History.com, it was categorized as an extreme failure on part of the U.S. government. It also called into question Kennedy's authority over foreign policy. His leadership would also be tested again in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. As the U.S. government had learned that the Soviet Union had missiles stationed in Cuba 50 miles off the coast of Florida, they wanted to immobilize immediately. Kennedy refused this, instead offering to try to negotiate a peaceful resolution with the current leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev would ultimately agree to the terms and conditions set by Kennedy, as long as Kennedy promised to not invade Cuba upon them leaving and remove his missiles from Turkey. This decision would ultimately prove to be the correct one, as Kennedy would avoid an outright nuclear war between the two superpowers. Kennedy obviously had his hands full with overseas conflict. However, he also had his hands full back at home in the States. Kennedy was an advocate for the space race. He gave many speeches on why the space race was important and why we should have a man put on the moon before the end of the decade. These speeches would explode in popularity over the years, raising an astronomical amount of money towards the space race program. Even though Kennedy would not live to see it, his contribution to the program would influence greatly the Apollo 11 mission putting a man on the moon in 1969. Kennedy was also an advocate for African American civil rights. He was no stranger to advocating for desegregation in schools, and he wrote many pieces of legislation that would eventually become the Civil Rights Movement, or Civil Rights Act of 1964. He pushed heavily for the desegregation of schools and got authorization from the government to allow African American students to go to colleges and high schools in southern states of the U.S. President Kennedy would also create the Peace Corps in 1961, which on the Peace Corps' official website describes itself as a place where American students can study abroad for things like education, agriculture, and healthcare. But despite his many accomplishments, President Kennedy was no stranger to controversy within his own presidency. The first one I'll talk about is the Vietnam War. President Kennedy pushed heavily for an increased military presence in the South Vietnam country. Now, while President Kennedy was in office, the war would not grow exponentially like it would under President Johnson, but President Kennedy's decisions to increase military influence within Vietnam planted the seeds for a massive expansion later in the years of the war. President Kennedy's personal life would also be called into question. In an article written by Alexandria Belissi on the NewYorkPost.com website, it was described as Kennedy having an affair with famous actor Marilyn Monroe. While it was never confirmed whether or not Kennedy had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, there was many speculation around it at the time. It was very publicized within the news and on mainstream media of the time that Kennedy was having an affair while he was married, while he was in office. Love or hate President Kennedy, there's no denying that his leadership during the Cold War era, his development of civil rights for US citizens, as well as the space race, and the many controversies he had started while he was in his presidency, influenced America and set a precedent that would not be changed for many generations. In President Kennedy's own words, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I believe that is a question that more Americans should ask themselves today.